Good evening. We're going to get started with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for another opportunity to come together and fellowship with other Christians. We're thankful, dear Lord, that we can come together in a free country and worship you without worrying about being persecuted by others. Help us to use this time sharpening our skills and preparing ourselves to go out in the world and help other people. We're thankful for the sacrifice you made, sending your Son to die on the cross. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, according to our schedule, we're supposed to spend 1 week in Leviticus. And I drew the short straw. And I say that. Leviticus, Lamentations, and the Song of Solomon are the 3 books that I don't think I've ever taught much from. And I can cross Leviticus off my bucket list now. And the assignment was to look at the Day of Atonement and the feast days, and also the chapter 26, which I don't think you've gotten to in your reading yet, on obedience. And I'm going to be obedient, and I'm going to talk about those things. But that's not really what I came to talk to you about tonight. But we're going to start in Leviticus chapter 23. I realize the Day of Atonement stuff's in 16, and we'll come to it. But there are some observances mentioned in this book that were mandatory for the Jews. And I just thought if we put them all up on the board, we'll see just how many that they had to observe during the course of a year. And a couple of them were not yearly. One of them was every 7 years, one was every 50 years. But again, we'll get there. The first one is the Sabbath. Now, of course, that's part of the 10 Commandments. And we're going to look at it in more detail in just a few minutes. But that was the first, that's 23:3. You're right, Todd, that does help there. The second one is the Passover. What's the New Testament almost equivalent to the day to the Passover? The resurrection of Jesus. Easter, as the world calls it. Yes, you got it. I'm not handing out prizes, though. Oh, don't whisper in her ear. Let her do it by herself. Those are the two that coincide, because remember what Jesus was doing. the night he was arrested. He was observing the Passover with his disciples. If you've got like I do, I've got in my Bible here, the Old Testament feast and other sacred days. Passover is usually in the first month of the Jewish month. For us, it corresponds to either March or April, depending on how late it falls, that Easter falls for us. Okay, the next one is and this is one that I frankly missed all these years, the unleavened bread. Because when you finish the Passover, if you look in 23 verses 6 through 8, he talks about the Passover is the 14th of the month, and then the 15th you have, for 7 days you eat unleavened bread after that. It's considered to be a separate event from the Passover. Not sure exactly why, but it is. The first fruits. Again, this is probably a March or April for us. It tells us in verse 14, no. I had the date on there somewhere. That doesn't matter. They were to bring the first. It's almost like a blessing for the rest of the harvest kind of thing. You then have the weeks. When we think of the weeks, we call it usually by the New Testament name, which is, don't look at the screen, do it, Pentecost. It's also known as the harvest. But that's what was being celebrated when Peter and the other disciples were teaching on, wait for it, the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. That is a festival, by the way, of joy, it tells me here. Mandatory and voluntary offerings, including the first fruits of the wheat harvest. You then move to what's called trumpets in Leviticus, but we know it by a different name. Even those of us who aren't Jewish have heard Rosh Hashanah. That's the Jewish New Year. And for them, the Jewish New Year takes place, again, depending on where the moon is in their cycle, either in September or October. And there's a whole lot, just like there are in around the Passover and within 50 days of it, there's a whole lot of festivals that take place in that September-October period. This is the first one. This is their New Year that they celebrate. It's a day of rest. Well, let's see. That one is just a commemoration of it. It's a day of rest, all right, but it has the trumpet blast. Think of firing fireworks on midnight on January 1 like they do out at Shadow Lake, and you got an idea as to what they're doing there. Another one that we're very familiar with, and we're going to come back and look at, is Yom Kippur. That is the Day of Atonement, and again, we'll back up to Leviticus 16 in just a moment and take a look at it in more detail. Sometimes you will hear of athletes who will not participate in their sporting events. It's usually going to be the World Series. Sometimes it might be a football game, but they won't participate on that day. The most famous one that I can remember was Sandy Koufax during the World Series in '65, I believe it was, refused to pitch because that was their most holy of their holy days, the way they looked at it. The next one is the Feast of the Booths, also called the Feast of Tabernacles. That one was to commemorate the harvest. And during this one, and how'd you like to do this today? You were required to go put up a tent or some sort of shelter and live outside for 7 days. I don't even like to camp for a night. And to do that, I mean, I'd have done it, but I'd have grumbled as the children of Israel often did. And And then the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, there was supposed to be a year of rest and the fallow fields. They weren't supposed to be planting stuff like that. It's a rest for the land. And then the year of Jubilee, every 50 years. Who wants to tell me what they know about the year of Jubilee? You were nodding, David. What goes on at the Jubilee? Oh, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I thought you were nodding.
No, the year of Jubilee, and at one time I had planned to say some things about the year of Jubilee in lessons,
Yes?
and it's just hard to find anything that fits into a lesson really, really well, and what the Bible said has to say about the year of Jubilee. It's whatever 50 years or so.
Every 50 years. What was supposed to happen, Mark?
Well, again, it's one of those don't sow, don't reap deals. There's all manner of interesting things that occurred, like redemption of property. If say I sold you or you were buying property for me,
Mm-hmm.
some things are waived in regards to financial responsibility. Slavery issues were resolved. You became free in essence. There was all manner of really interesting things that almost had business transaction type.
Well, it was a start over period for a lot of people. As a result, the Jews that did not have the right attitude about it, when they saw the Jubilee year was coming up, they kind of slowed down their lending. There was also, and this is alluded to in the New Testament a little bit, the practice of putting the property in the name of the temple, and the temple didn't have to release it back to the original owner, and then after the year of Jubilee, they can give it back to whoever it was that donated it to the temple. It was a shell game. But they had to think of ways to get around the year of Jubilee. Otherwise, they had to let their slaves go. They had to cancel the debts and all the other things that go along with it. Those of you who are reading it can pick up on all that. And then there was one more that I thought I'd just throw in because it is one of their feast days, and that's Purim. It's mentioned in Esther. Those of you who have seen the production in Branson of at Sight and Sound of Esther will know what it is, or you've read the book, I guess, will know what it is that he's talking about. That is in our version of February and March, their 12th month and their 14th, 13th day, somewhere around there, they celebrate the fact that they did not get annihilated the way Haman had intended to. And it became a yearly festival and commemoration. All right. Like I say, we're going to go back and look at Sabbath in a moment. We're going to do Day of Atonement first. Any thoughts or questions about what I've got on the board right now, though?
3 of those were mandatory later for males to go to Jerusalem and
Good point.
do the Passover, and then they stay for the unleavened bread, and then they had to do Pentecost. So a lot of them would stay for that because it was 50 days, and then I think it was booths. I think it was Feast of Tabernacles.
I remember reading there were 3, and I don't remember which 3 there were.
That's the one in Nehemiah that they read about, and they're like, oh no, we haven't been doing that.
Right. Well, and then if you didn't hear Mark, they read in Nehemiah, there was one they read about in the scrolls. They said, we hadn't been doing that. Same thing happened with Josiah, that they realized that, oh, we haven't been doing this. And
I'm certain on the first day, don't quote me, but
I-
I'll look it up.
well, yeah, I probably have it here in front of me somewhere. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's back up to chapter 16 just for a moment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because there's 21 points of order that the priest and the people did to to fulfill the duties of the Day of Atonement. And I could read them to you, but I can't expound on it. There's a couple of things that we take from this, and in every lesson that I teach, or most every lesson that I teach in the classroom, I ask a question. Who in my classroom knows what the question is? How does this apply to us today? And for a lot of this, I couldn't find a specific application for about how the bull was to be done and all that. But there's two big points that you need to take out of this. Number one, and I'm borrowing this one from Russ Bowman, those of you who heard his sermon here a few years ago on this chapter, best I'd ever heard on it, and cannot improve on it. Don't know if it's online or not, but if it isn't, we need to find one of Russ's and post it on this particular topic. But number one, this and all the others is the exactness of God. How he was capable of communicating what he wanted to his people. And he didn't forget, when we got to the New Testament, how to communicate to his people what he wanted. He's a good communicator. Our problem often is not understanding what's said, was going. And if you think about the scene of the sacrifices and how ugly it was, think about how ugly sin is from God's perspective. We'll tolerate it. Sometimes even societally we'll accept it, but God hasn't changed. I mean, his laws have changed for us, but his attitude towards sin has not changed. And when you read Leviticus 16, you ought to be struck by just how awful it was to do away with those sins, to atone for them for that year. And it had to be done every year. Any other thoughts that you picked up on in reading about the Day of Atonement you want to share now?
Well, that there was a need to begin with.
Yeah, well, yes, a recognition of the need. I mean, the folks that say, well, I don't need that, are kidding themselves. Again, you look at the exactness of God and all the rules that they were supposed to keep, and at the end of the year someone says, yeah, I got them all. Probably not. Yeah, Jim.
Dr. Bailey, I think, talked about this last week as well, but we think about what you had just mentioned of the sight, the sound, and the smell.
Yes, and Mark did touch on that, yes.
That would have to stay with you for a long time.
And you would think, you would think that people would say, I'm going to be better this next year. But at the end of that next year, they're still going to need to have their sins atoned. Yes?
This is a stretch by any sense of Bible reasoning. But I go back to the Genesis 3 situation where God made skins for Adam and Eve.
Yes?
We don't talk about that much, but animals died for those sins,
Sure.
for them to be clothed.
Right.
Now, the next chapter, we've got Abel and Cain offering the sacrifice. And I stuck my head in Warren's classroom and said, I want you to think about something. In my mind, there's only two reasons why those men would be offering sacrifices. One, either worship, or two, the same reason that these people are offering
Sin.
sacrifices.
Right.
And I'm wondering out loud, is there a bridge there? And now this is something that for all peoples, there has to be a sacrifice. And fortunately, you and I benefit from the sacrifice of our Savior in the style of Hebrews 9 and Hebrews 10.
Other thoughts? There is nothing on that board that you're looking at that I want to go back to. None of it. I mean, wish that our Savior did not have to go through what he went through for us, but I'm so thankful that he did. Okay, I've decided that the last 5 minutes I'm going to talk about chapter 26. So what I want to talk about now is something that caught my attention as I was looking through this. When I looked at the Sabbath part was in here, I know the Sabbath from the Ten Commandments, but we have friends and neighbors that have a view of Sabbath even today. There are some groups who call themselves Sabbatarians. We have the Seventh-day Adventist, and then there are some that believe Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. What I'm going to do for the next 15 minutes or so is take a look at how the Jewish leaders interpreted a very simple verse. And I'm not going back to Exodus. Just look at Leviticus 23:3. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. Well, that also, some of your translations have sacred assembly there. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. I've got 13, 14 pages of the rules, and this is just scratching the surface, because there are page after page in the Talmud and the Mishrah, those are the writings of the Jewish elders, about how to keep this verse. And I'm just going to share a few of them with you tonight. There were 39 Sabbath regulations. There they are. Things that you were not supposed to do on the Sabbath. Now, some of them, if you look, kind of fit into categories. I didn't break the categories down for us, but like on that first column, well, I'll come over here. On the first column, you've got sewing and tearing and washing and knotting and untying and shaping. That's kind of construction, or that's dealing with fabrics, the washing. Where's dye? Oh, that's over here too, the fabrics and stuff. Then you've got the farming. And you've got dealing with animals. This is the leather goods. One of the things that I read for this said part of that has to do with the material curtains, and others had to do with leather curtains. They're talking about the tabernacle. But from that verse, let's just take a look real quick at what carrying means. It involves carrying in a public place. It's one of the few categories of work that's mentioned in what they call the Torah, what we call the first 5 books, that where carrying was prohibited. Can you tell me what was prohibited to be carried, specifically prohibited to be carried? I can think of 2. What? No, I'm talking about on the Sabbath. Well, you're not supposed to touch a dead body, but that, what? Manna. You weren't supposed to go out and carry manna on that day. And firewood. Those are 2 instances that we can think of that carrying was prohibited. I'll tell you this story real quick, and it'll be fairly quick. Many of you know that I have a friend who lived in New York, wrote for the New York Times, and he and I met on a Beatles bulletin board, and we have since met in person. And he's a dear friend. I mean, he really is. Paul McCartney was playing a concert in New Jersey at the Meadowlands. And he was trying to figure out how he could go to the concert and not break the Sabbath laws on Friday night. And he sent me an email and said, I think I figured it out. I think I know how I can do it. He was married to a non-Jewish woman, so she was going to carry the money and the tickets. She would have paid, I think they were going to rent a car and drive over, and she would have to, we'll get to burning in just a second. He came up with all this convoluted thing, and at the end he said, but I think it violates the spirit of it. Good one, Alan. Carrying, according to this, and this is from a Jewish source here, Carrying is the prototype of all other Sabbath type of work. It's the definition of such work where any act where man demonstrates his mastery over nature. On the Sabbath, and this is what has escaped me for all these years, God rested from creation on the Sabbath, and therefore we're not supposed to do anything creative on the Sabbath. We're not supposed to create anything because that's the rest. Again, remember, I'm talking about how the Jews, all the way up through Jesus' day and time, and according to my friend Alan, still not supposed to carry stuff today. I mentioned that was public. Carrying in a private home is permitted. It's only the public domain that's forbidden. However, the spirit of the law forbids carrying or handling unnecessary objects even indoors. That includes money, candles, pebbles and stones. One of Alan's friends was here in Fort Smith 20-something years ago, and Alan connected us because he needed to go to a courthouse and do something. I said, I'll be glad to help him. On Friday night, he was at his motel, and he called for a pizza, and before the sun set, he sat out the money on the counter or on the dresser, including the tip for the pizza, so when the guy got there, he had to pick up the money and leave the pizza. He couldn't handle money on the Sabbath. And on any of these, you got questions or comments, just throw them out. I know you didn't know I was going to do this tonight. Oops. Back it up. Back it up. Joey, John, put that back up there if you would for me, please. There you go. One more. Okay. Burning. That involves making a fire or causing anything to burn. It's another category that was in the Old Testament. It was in Exodus 35. You shall not light a fire at home on the Sabbath day. Easy rule, right? Don't light a fire. Yes?
Laurie wants to know if you can microwave something.
No, you cannot. I'll get to that in a second. The use of fire, according to this, is one of the prime ways man demonstrates his mastery over nature. It's one of the cornerstones of human civilization, of course. It is. And you can't strike a match. Smoking is prohibited on the Sabbath. Automobile engine works by internal combustion. It burns gasoline. You can't start the ignition. You can't heat a piece of metal so that it glows in the category. That's the category of burning. So you can't turn on any electrical devices. You can't use the telephone. I happened to be at Alan's apartment when I was in New York in '96, and on Friday afternoon, this was in March, so whatever time the sun was going down, I watched him running around his apartment like Tom Cruise in Risky Business, just hustling down the hall, making sure that he had all of his timers set the next day so that he could listen to NPR or whatever television show he wanted to come on at whatever time, but he couldn't touch it. And there's another little factor about that. If you can't create electricity and you live on the 12th floor of your building, you can't use the elevator. Alan told me that the Gentiles in New York were generally understanding of that, and if they saw a Jew standing outside of an elevator and just standing, they'd push the button for them and reach in and hit the floor for them. But that is one of the rules that the Jewish hierarchy came up with, that you can't create a fire, and it's been brought forward now for us. Joe, I'm going to need the timer on that thing. Go ahead. Incandescent lights.
So they've got to either arrange for the lights that they want on.
Right.
To be on. And so
Thank you.
So they don't turn anything on.
Exactly. Now, if you can't burn, you can't extinguish. You're going to have a lot of these that it goes both ways. But however, just like when we read in the New Testament about when your ox is falling into a ditch, you can get it out on the Sabbath. Hurt someone, you can put it out. It's okay. You can't start one, but you can put it out under those circumstances. The next one I had here was finishing, but that's all sorts of repairs or adjustments. You're going to love this one. This heading also forbids us to cut or tear paper in any way. To take a very mundane example, one observing the Sabbath may not tear toilet paper. Religious Jews, therefore, use pre-cut paper. Finishing touches, you cannot put new laces in your shoes on that day. You cannot tune a musical instrument that day. In fact, the rabbis forbade all use of musical instruments on the Sabbath. Let's see, writing. Well, when you write something, you are creating something. So you can't do that. And that's typing, printing, using a rubber stamp. Anything that creates something new cannot be done. And if you can't write, you also can't erase something that's already there because, and this one I liked, although it is permitted to tear a package to get the food inside, this should be avoided when the tearing goes through the writing on the package. Yep, you'd be tearing up the writing. Cooking, that's all sorts of cooking and baking. Boiling water even fits into that category because you couldn't turn on the heat because that would be burning. And I like this one, and all I'm going to tell you is what it says because I don't understand it. Under some conditions, it's permitted to rewarm food that is already cooked. Not microwave though, because you're making a spark. These laws appear very complex when put in writing, while being very simple in actual practice. The best thing is to see how a true Sabbath observer prepares hot food for that day. I need to move. Washing, just exactly what you think. Wringing out a wet garment also falls into that category, by the way. Sewing includes all sorts of needlework. Pasting, taping, and stapling paper together is also included. Yeah, well, now that's emergency stuff. That's emergency. They're not fanatic about it. Really? Oh, you caught that, huh? But you cannot paste, tape, or staple paper. You can't seal an envelope or attach a postage stamp. You can fasten it with a safety pin. Because that's a temporary fastening. That's not permanent like licking an envelope kind of thing is. Tearing, well, that's the undoing of any form of sewing. Separating glued papers would fall into that category. Knotting. Any kind of permanent knot. But you can tie a bow, like on your shoelace. You can tie your shoelaces on a Sabbath. Untying. Well, if you can't knot, then you can't unknot. If it's made to be permanent, you can't untie it. If it's not, then you can, such as a shoelace. Or if one's shoelaces become horribly knotted, then you can untie it. I don't make the rules, I'm just telling you what they are. Shaping. That's cutting an object into a desired shape. That would also fall into the category of sculpting. Working with wood or metal on a lathe or a mill would fit into that. But foods are not in that category. If you've got a pie, you can cut a piece out. Again, I don't make the rules. Plowing. Any work that improves the ground, changes the ground, you're creating something different, and you can't do that. Digging a garden, fertilizing is under that heading. Raking the lawn, and Todd's favorite, mowing your yard on Sunday or on Sabbath, you can't do that. You can't water plants either because that encourages plants to grow. That's changing. Can't do it. Reaping is the cutting or plucking of any growing thing, and I wanted to hit this one because you'll remember Jesus had a conversation about his disciples plucking the head off of wheat or something, great corn, and eating it. And they said, do your guys not keep the Sabbath? They're talking to Jesus, who was there when the Sabbath was instituted, and they're asking him about why they don't keep the Sabbath the way they want to, or think it should be done. Harvesting would be binding grain into, or grass into bales or sheaves or whatever. Threshing is separating food from its natural container. You cannot squeeze a fruit for its juice. You cannot milk a cow at that time. You can't thresh grain to remove it from its husk on the Sabbath. Winnowing is letting the wind do it for you. You can't do that. Selecting. I've read this several times. I don't quite get it. If one is eating berries, he may not pick out the bad ones before eating the good ones. However, he can eat the good ones and leave the bad. It's likewise permitted to peel fruits and vegetables for immediate consumption. If you're going to eat a banana, you don't have to eat the peel on the Sabbath. Sifting, again, that's removing unwanted portions of food by means of a sieve. Grinding, using a milling grain. Also, grinding coffee or pepper during that day is not permitted. Also, that would affect medicines. Oh dear. Because a lot of medicines were ground. Anyway, you're getting the point as to what man made out of one verse. All the rules they came up with. And you might say, well, they're just being careful. And in some instances, maybe they were. I'm not going to say, a whole lot about their original intent, but we know, and the reason I want to go over it, we know by the time we got to the New Testament times what they had done with that one simple word. Now, last, we're going to look at the blessings of obedience in Leviticus 26:17. And it's very simple. I almost did a slide on it. If you're good, things are going to go good. And if you're bad, things are going to go bad. But it's going to be a collective. We know that from reading Judges in particular. You read the book of Judges, and you'll have a period of decades where things are going good for the Jews. And then they stop keeping the law the way they're supposed to, and things go bad. And then someone will rise up, Gideon or Jephthah or Samson, or any of the judges would rise up to try to get things back on track the way it should be. But what I wanted you to take from 26 is it's a collective nationwide judgment. And just like I said earlier, that I don't want to live under any of those feast days and things, I'm glad that in America, we aren't getting judged collectively. You want that? You ever hear anybody say that America is a Christian nation? It's not. And don't say that, because what you're doing is you're making Jesus responsible for us if we are His. We are a nation that is hospitable to Christianity. And I am so thankful that we are. But this is not, nor, if you know your American history, you know it has never been a Christian nation. The way that phrase, the way I understand that phrase anyway. The penalties of disobedience, starting in verse 14. If you do not obey me and do not carry out all these commandments, and again, remember, Moses is talking to everyone. If instead you reject my statutes and your soul, if your soul abhors my ordinances not to carry out all my commandments and break my covenant, in turn will I do this to you. I will appoint over you a sudden terror, consumption and fever will waste away your eyes. And again, you just read on. 25, I will bring upon you a sword to execute vengeance for the covenant. 29, You will eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters you will eat. I mean, and we read as we go forward through the book of Judges and First and Second Samuel, and First and Second Kings, the Chronicles, Jeremiah, all those that record the history after this time, they were warned. They had a special covenant with God. They had special blessings because of that special covenant, and they had special responsibilities. We got 1 minute, 58 seconds. Yes, Paula.
Are there any modern day Jews that sacrifice, that make sacrifices, and if not, why?
The question was, are there any modern day Jews that sacrifice the animal sacrifices? And if not, why not? I'm not aware of any, and I don't know why they wouldn't if they're trying to keep these laws. Now, you also got to remember, when you say Jews, you've got your Reform, your Orthodox, and your Conservative. It's almost like saying, what does a Catholic believe or what does a Baptist believe? There's variations within the groups. Or what does a Muslim believe? Shia or Sunni or what? So, but as far as I know, none of the three major groups do animal sacrifices anyway. How can they? They don't have a temple. Thank you for your attention.